Hello, Dr. Ron Eglin. I'm going to take you on a quick tour of Visual Studio Ultimate 2013. I'm going to assume that you really have no knowledge of Visual Studio, but you actually have some knowledge of web development and HTML and some of the things that go into that type of programming so that you kind of get used to the environment of Ultimate 2013. Now, this is designed for my class COP4834, which does use Visual Studio. So, if you've correctly installed Visual Studio and you've done the download, you've got everything up and running, you should see, and you start it, it should look something like this. That beautiful screen that you're going to have to start deciding what to do. What we will do is we will start with a new project. Okay, so let's do that. Now, we will talk about during the class other things like source control and other things that you can do, but right now, we're going to go right off the bat with this new project, and that's going to bring up the new project screen. Now, in the new project screen, you've got lots of different options. So in other words, if you want to make a Windows application, well, guess what? You click over here on Windows, and it gives you a whole lot of different options for Windows applications. And you will probably at some point do something like a console application, which is extremely handy to be able to do console applications, especially when you're trying to put together some code and you just want to play with it. But for this class, we're actually making web applications, and we really got one choice here of an ASP.NET web application. Now, ASP.NET works within the .NET framework, and you do want to be able to choose a version of .NET that you're going to build your application for. With Visual Studio Ultimate, the default is 4.6. We're well beyond 4.6 now, and we've actually got newer versions of Visual Studio coming up, but that's what we're going to do, is work with 4.5. And right now, we're not going to write any code anyway, so it doesn't matter. Now, we're going to call this Web Form Application 2, just because I do multiple of these. And the reason is because the application I'm going to make is going to be a web form application, and you'll see what that means in just a minute. So once I've chosen an ASP.NET web application, and I've given it a name, and it's going to have a location where it puts the project, I can click OK. At this stage, I am not adding it to source control, but I am creating a directory for the solution itself. And there's actually something to understand about the concept of solution and project files, which again, we will cover. Once I do that, I'm going to go ahead and get this screen that allows me to select the template it's going to build it on. Now, you can choose empty, and it will build it on a blank nothing template. So in other words, there won't be any authentication, there won't be any core references to things like the different frameworks that you would build underneath. And watch as I go through the different options here. Now, we're going to actually do web forms. So the template itself uses a web forms template. It's got core references to how the web forms framework works. It has an authentication of individual user accounts, which, by the way, you have the ability to change. You can actually have it say no authentication, or you could say that you wanted to use Windows authentication. And within individual user accounts, once you build your application, they can actually use user accounts at a number of open authorization providers such as Facebook, Twitter, Google, or Microsoft, so that they don't even have to create their own account. You can use these frameworks of user accounts within your application relatively easily. Now, one of the most common frameworks in use, and remember, this is a framework. This here is a template that uses a specific framework, and this framework has to have the references in your template to the framework. So notice as I clicked MVC, it puts the core references to MVC. It takes away web forms and web API. You can, in this one too, you can change the authentication. And also notice down here, add unit tests. Typically, if you're going to use MVC, you're probably going to put unit tests in, which simplify the process of testing your application. And actually, I recommend anytime you build one of an application in ASP.NET, you go ahead and put the unit tests in there. I do have some coverage of that. Now, the fourth one that we're looking at here is called a web API, which is actually going to put in the references to use RESTful. If you haven't used RESTful, essentially, and let's first look at what you would use an application, this type of application for. Well, suppose you want to write an application that's a series of libraries that you want to make available over the web, but they don't have a specific front end. You basically want to be able to call function calls to an API and bring it back. And actually a good example of this is an authentication system that is built externally of your application. Okay, well, in this case, you wouldn't necessarily need to build an authentication system, a login and user and login, because there's a lot of them out there, but that's something you could use this for. I use it for technical libraries that I build that are used amongst multiple projects. Now remember that this is an HTTP service, so for applications to be able to use this web API, they have to have access to the internet and be able to, through a URI, call the functions that are in the web API. But this allows you to write those. Single page application. Okay. In this case, this is the simple, hey, I'm not really doing a lot of .NET stuff. I'm doing HTML and CSS and some JavaScript, and it's the concept of the blank HTML page. And then last but not least, one that I have not used, I'll go ahead and tell you right now, which I may use later on, is the a Facebook application, which it does have an interface to create Facebook applications, and I'm going to actually probably play with them in the future. But in this case, not even going to go too much into that. Now, in this case, and for this example, we're going to go ahead and make a web forms application with unit tests, with the default individual user account authentication. And when I click go, it's going to start whirring. And when I get done with the whirring of it making my solution and my projects from the template, I should have a nice, well, in this case, a nice solution, which is actually may have multiple projects in it, and it will show up kind of like this. So notice here at the top, I'm going to look at the Solution Explorer here for a second. I have a solution called Web Forms Application 2. This, by the way, would be a project, Web Forms Application 2 within the solution. Allows me to have multiple projects within a single solution. And the reason is, in this case, the tests themselves are a separate project within the solution. So let's take a quick tour of all the stuff that's actually in here. Now, you'll also be quickly drawn to this page, Your ASP.NET Application. It looks like it's actually done some stuff here. And watch this. If I run this, I click the run here, and I run it in Firefox. Okay, Firefox is zooming up over here. I'm going to bring it over so you can see it. I'm just going to run it on my local host. And it actually has an application running here with Get More Libraries. I've got Learn More. It takes me all this information. It's an actual, now remember that was an external link. So, but it's got information that's really a real application. A name called application name. But isn't that interesting? I've got a fully fledged application with a login and registration system already built in. Well, guess what? We're really not going into that right now. I'm going to go ahead and click the Stop Debugging because I was in debugging mode. And let's look a little bit about some of the stuff that is in there. I'm going to kind of pull this over a little bit here. And first, references. These are libraries that are being used in your application. For the most part, you're not going to mess with them, but later on down the line, you'll likely may add references and remove references as you decide to use different tools along the way. App data. Now, there's no data yet. And the reason is if I were to go and create this application and I was to log in, it's going to have to store login information. Well, then there's going to be data because I've got a login and a password. But ASP.NET, by default, will put this into, in this case, a SQL Express database. And, well, how do I even find out about stuff like that? Well, down here in the web config, okay, which we'll move over a little bit, I will actually look down here. I have this connection strings, an add name default connection. If you know your database, you know that a default connection or a connection string points to a database. And that database, which is actually referenced in this connection string, will be the database where it stores the user login information. When you're thinking, I haven't even created any tables for my login information. Well, guess what? There's a default table setup that goes with ASP.NET that will automatically create that table structure and put that data in there the first time a person tries to register a user in there. So that stuff is all going to appear. It's like, wow, a lot of this stuff is really automated. Now, app start, okay, that is a directory and it's got stuff in it. And you can see there's these 3 files in there. Well, what are these 3 files? Well, first, let's look at the extension, which tells you some information. The bundle.config.cs is a C# file. It's written in C#, so it is code. And if I click on it, it's going to actually bring the code up over here. Now, we're not going to worry about what that is just yet, other than the fact that you can see that there's some C# code that was written in there and it does something. We're not going to worry about that something just yet because you are going to write code that does stuff. Content, if you look at that, you'll notice that you've got some CSS files. And if you're familiar with web programming, you might recognize Bootstrap, okay, as a CSS file that you might have seen before. So don't worry about that one just yet either. Then you see this one, models. If you were used to Visual Studio 2012, you've got a new one, but if you did MVC programming, you're like, well, I'm used to models. And because the identity system itself uses a model architecture, you'll have this models. And you've got and this is again C# code. Again, not something we're going to go into right this minute because we're kind of running through the structure of this. Okay, scripts, those are all JavaScripts, and they're in the scripts directory. And then we've got some other things here. We have an about.aspx. Well, let's double click that, and you'll notice that it brings up an about.aspx page. And down here you've got this design view, and you've got a source view. Okay, and there's the design view, and here's the source view. I almost always work in source view. I very rarely work in design view. And if you look at that, it looks just like HTML with some ASP tags that are in there. Now, another thing to look at for an example of something here is you've seen this ASPX, and ASPX are .NET web pages. But let's look at something else that we've got here. Let's go up into this account directory, which I did skip over. It's got some ASPX pages. It's also got an ASCX, which is a user control. User controls are actually things that you build that you can drop onto pages. So if I saw this user control, openauth providers.ascx, I know that somewhere I'm probably going to be using that user control on a page. And actually, the page that uses it in this case is login. And if you notice up here at the very top of the login page, you've got this register. What it's doing is it's actually registering that this page is going to use this user control, which is another piece of code that's going to be used within an ASPX page. Well, all that really tells you is that you've got the ability to create pieces of code as user controls and reuse them in multiple pages. Okay, one of the fundamental pieces of .NET architecture is that ability to do that. That and another one, which down here we're going to again go further on down the line to this site.master. Okay, pages can inherit the interface from other pages, and one of these pages that the pages will inherit from is site.master. You've also got a site.mobile.master. So when I create an ASPX page, the ASPX page can inherit directly from a master page file, which, for example, here, the default.aspx up here where we've actually declared the page itself, we've got master page file, and you see that it uses site.master, so therefore the interface is essentially inherited from the site.master interface, master, which is a master page. The last thing I'm going to cover in this, which is going to be very, so you get this real fast whirlwind overview, is this web.config file, which is going to be very important to you in web programming. The web.config really controls the configuration of your solution, and there are many things that you'll put into this because it's the configuration of your solution. So, for example, that connection strings, which says that at some point we're going to go ahead and use a database, and that database is going to have a name that's going to be a name for a connection string that points to the database, and that name is default connection. Well, I got all that just from connection strings and add name and then the connection string itself right there in the web.config. I didn't expect everybody here to follow every bit of that, But to do it, you are going to need to understand that that web.config contains the configuration information that is going to be important to you. So you just had a 15-minute whirlwind tour of Visual Studio Ultimate. At this point, I recommend you get it installed. You create a default web form application and start playing with it. Don't be worried about breaking it. Okay, you're always going to be able to create a new project, and the best way to code is to get in and code. Thank you very much, and thanks for bearing me with on this whirlwind 15-minute tour of it. Good programming.